We're going through the Bible front to back, reading it more like a novel than the way we usually do. We oftentimes read our Bible bits and pieces here and there, a phrase there, a verse over here, maybe a chapter over there. And we're going to take it front to back, straight through. And we started with Genesis at the beginning of the quarter, and now we're up to chapter 19. If you want to turn in your Bible to Genesis chapter 19. We've been tracing how God is taking care of his people, how he's fulfilling his promise that he really initially started with Eve in the garden after they sinned and after they fell. And God promised that someday he would send that ultimate seed to fix the problem that was created by the fall in the garden. And we saw down through the flood how God preserved the two lines that he said he would. There was still enmity and conflict between them, and yet he preserved the good line so that he could provide his promised Redeemer, his seed, one day. So much so that he had to destroy the entire earth to do it. When the population was in danger of that covenant being broken, God went to drastic measures to protect his covenant. And he separated out Noah and his family, and he saved them while the rest of the earth died and they drowned. And Noah got off the boat, and God said, I will never, ever do that again. And true to his word, he did not. And so when all the people started gathering together and meshing and molding together in the Tower of Babylon, instead of destroying the world with a flood, he split up the world by providing different languages. And so the people separated out. And finally, in the days of Abraham, which we started 2 weeks ago, last session, God shows out for himself a specific family, specific line, beginning with Abraham. He said, you are going to be the avenue through which my promise is fulfilled. And we got to chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, when God promises Abraham that he'd become a nation, that he would inherit a certain land, and that all nations through him would be blessed, and referring to that ultimate seed that God had promised. And that's kind of where we left off last week. And God had promised Abraham that he would have a son that would carry on this promise. And sure enough, Abraham got together with Hagar and had a boy named Ishmael, which sounded like a great idea at the time. But God said, no, that's not really the way it's going to work out. You're going to have a baby with Sarah. Oh, he says. And so once again, what do we see? Even within this specific family, we start to see a division of the two lines, of the two sons, Ishmael's sons and Isaac's sons. Last week we ended up in chapter 18, and Abraham is sitting there. Of course, God comes and repeats the promise to him that he would have a son through Sarah. And she laughs, and he laughs, and everybody laughs. And God says, I'm glad you're all laughing, because that's going to be the name of your son. Your son's name will be Isaac. It means he laughs a lot. Laughs kind of for two reasons. We'll see it a little bit later. But one, because she laughed when God told her that. She was hiding behind the tent door, and she heard God say, you're going to have a son with Sarah. And Sarah went, ha, 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 ha. And God said, oh, Sarah, you back there? I heard you laugh. And she said, what? I didn't laugh. God said, oh, yes, you laughed. And so you're going to name your son He Laughs, or Laughter. Oh, and so every time she calls in the son, hey, Laughter, it's time for supper time, she has to remember, oh, yeah, when God promised that I would have the son, I kind of laughed. But in verse 19 of that chapter, we see God talking to Abraham, and God is referring to what he's about to do to Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, you kind of wonder, why does God bring in a story like this? And the story itself takes place in chapter 19, and it's a pretty gritty, pretty ugly story. It's really uncomfortable, but he includes it in here. In verse 19, again, it says, in verse 18, it says, should I tell Abraham what I'm going to do? He's going to become a mighty nation. All nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. Verse 19, for I have chosen him, Abraham, that he may command his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. I have separated out Abraham to be my special guy who will follow me, who will teach his kids to follow me, generation after generation, to do what's right, to be my representative here on earth to all the wicked people. The rest of the chapter talks about what God plans, and in verse 25, Abraham is starting the whole bargaining thing with God that this story is so well known for. But Abraham says, far be it from you, God, to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. You're a God of justice, are you not, God? Why would you punish the righteous for the deeds done by the wicked? Should he not separate them out or have mercy? In other words, which are you more willing to do, God, to punish the righteous in order to also punish the wicked? Or would you rather have mercy on the wicked to also have mercy on the righteous? What kind of God are you? Which would you prefer? And that's a really profound question. And so he starts the whole bickering back and forth, almost like a used car purchase, Well, if you find 50 good people, would you spare the entire city of wicked people for the sake of 50? And God says, yeah, okay, I'll do that. Well, what about 40? Well, okay, 40. Well, what about 30? Okay, fine. 20, fine. They got all the way down to, I think it's 10 people. And God says, all right, for the sake of 10 people, I will have mercy on all those wicked people there. And God kind of answers Abraham's question, doesn't he? That's what I'm interested in. I really, really, really prefer mercy and forgiveness over judgment and anger. Not that the judgment and anger isn't part of who God is, not that it's not necessary, not that he won't bring it on especially individuals ultimately in the final judgment. But if at all possible, he really loves that patience and mercy. Unfortunately, there were not 10 people in the city. There was only Lot and his family. And that's where we pick it up in chapter 19. And I've decided to read it all the way through. Again, it's an uncomfortable story, but it is in here. So let's read it. Chapter 19. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Now when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth, and he said, My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way. Again, custom back then, strangers come in. There are no Hotel 6s or anything like that, so you bring him into your house. He's being very hospitable, but I think he also somehow recognizes that these are not normal people. I'm not entirely sure how that happens, but he seems to have throughout the chapter. And he also probably knows what kind of city he is living in. He says, it's not good for you guys to be out here. You better come in with me. So they said, no, we'll spend the night in the town square. We'll just sleep on the bench out here. That's fine. Verse 3, but he pressed them strongly so that they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked them unleavened bread, and they ate. He's very kind and hospitable to them. Verse 4, but before they lay down, before it was even bedtime, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people, to the last man, every one, surrounded the house. And they called out to Lot, where are the men that came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so we may know them. Again, they're not talking about a welcoming committee wanting to shake their hand and offer them coffee. I think NIV gets a little bit more direct, if I remember. Probably KJV euphemizes this a little bit, but they want to be... they want to be very sexual with them. Okay, that's what they want. Bring them out here so we can play with them for a while, like a cat plays with a mouse or something. We want to abuse them for a while. That's what they're saying. Verse 6, Lot went out to the men at the entrance and shut the door after him. And he said, I beg you, brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, here, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Can you imagine saying that? What in the world is going on here? I have 2 girls. Why don't you just use them for a while instead of these guys? I can't even explain what's going on here. But that's what happened. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they said, stand back, the guys said. And they said, this fellow came to sojourn, and he's become the judge. You're just a visitor here. Now you're telling us what to do? Now we'll deal worse with you than with them. You think we're going to abuse them? We're going to abuse you even worse now. How do you like that, Lot? Then they pressed hard against this man Lot and drew near to break the door down. But when the men reached out their hands, that would be the angels, reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out, groping for the door. So these angels, they struck the people with blindness. Somehow they could not find the door anymore. They're just kind of running around each other, I guess, outside. And it's a chaotic scene. Verse 12, the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here? Son-in-law, sons, daughters, any ones you have in the city, bring them out of the place. For we're about to destroy this place because the outcry against his people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and said to his son-in-laws who were to marry his daughters, get up, get out of this place, for the Lord's about to destroy the city. But he seemed to his sons-in-laws to be jesting. They thought he was just kidding around. They didn't take him seriously. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, I believe probably because of the conversation with Abraham. And they brought him out and set him outside the city. And they brought them out. One said, "Escape for your life. Don't look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight. You've shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I can't escape to the hills, lest disaster overtake me and I die." So on and so forth. He talks him into going to this little town off to the side. But an ugly, ugly story about Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, you think, why do I even have to read about this stuff? Why did you put this in here? Again, it's uncomfortable enough. We almost don't want to read it in front of church. It's so ugly. But we think back to chapter 18, verse 19, where God said, "Abraham, you are the guy that's going to be my representative here to all the peoples around you, to all the evil people." And then verse 19 simply gives us a description of who those evil people are. And we see, once again, the contrast between God's chosen family and the evil line, the evil seed that we have running around on earth. Well, chapter 23 through the rest of the chapter, we see God does exactly what he said. He rains down fire and brimstone on the 2 cities. He blows up the cities. He destroys them. He burns them to a crisp. It says the sun comes up and Abraham walks out to his front porch of his tent, and he's got his coffee in his hand, and he looks off to the side where Sodom and Gomorrah used to be, and he sees what? Nothing but a whole bunch of smoke coming up. And Abraham knows exactly what happened to those cities because God had told him what he was going to do. And he realizes there must not have been 10 people. And he probably thinks, of course this was, Facebook and texting wasn't available at that time. He probably thinks, I hope there's at least 4 people left, because those were my 4 people. And I hope God was the God of mercy that he told me he was the other day, because I hope those people are not fried along with them. And sure enough, God was, and he spared Lot and his family, but the rest of them, he destroyed. And again, he shows both his mercy and his kindness and also his judgment and his righteousness all at the same time, because he split them out. And sometimes God doesn't have to choose between mercy or justice, does he? In fact, he never has to choose. He executed both. He showed mercy to those who should have received it, and he showed judgment to those who should have received it. And he did everything just right. Verse 29, "So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham, and he sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived." So we see then that Sodom and Gomorrah became the epitome of wickedness throughout the Bible. In fact, we're going to get to this in the book of Judges. So you lock this chapter away in your mind. We'll come back to it in like a quarter and a half. Okay, can you remember it that long? We will come back to this chapter. But God also demonstrated his discernment between good and evil by saving Lot from destruction. He did both at the same time. And it kind of refers to this back in Jude 7 and 2 Peter chapter 2. We're not going to turn to them this morning. You can look those up on your own. But he goes back and he talks about this very situation, how Lot was vexed in the city, but God saved him out of it and destroyed the rest of the city, and showed his character in doing just that. The rest of the chapter talks about Lot and his daughters. It's another kind of ugly scene, how maybe Lot took some more souvenirs from Sodom and Gomorrah than he really thought he might have, and wickedness kind of continues. More nations are born out of that whole situation. We're not going to go into detail on that one just because we can't cover every story. This is supposed to be a survey, and we're already going to spend almost the whole quarter on Genesis. But it's fun. That brings us to chapter 20. Chapter 20, I want to read the first part of it to you, and I need you to see if this sounds familiar to you at all, if you've been in here. Chapter 20, "From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, 'She is my sister.' And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, 'Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman that you have taken, for she is a man's wife.' Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, 'Lord, will you kill innocent people? Did he not say to me, she's my sister?' And she herself said that he's my brother. In the integrity of my heart and in the innocence of my hands I have done this." Then God came to him in the dream and said, "Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours." God says, "You've taken somebody's wife, and if you don't give her back, I will pound you into the ground." And he says, I didn't know. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I really, I had no idea. God says, "Yeah, I know. It's okay. And I kept you from really destroying yourself here in this situation. But you better make it right as soon as possible, or I will come back and pound you, and you'll be dead." Verse 8, "So Abimelech rose early in the morning," I'll bet he did, "and called all of his servants and told all of them these things. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called to Abraham and said to him, 'What have you done to us? How have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me the things that ought not to be done.' And Abimelech said to Abraham, 'What did you see that you did this thing?' Abraham said, 'Well, I did it because I thought, look, there's no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do to me. At every place at which we come, say of me, he's my brother," which again is a fine way to be with your spouse. Everywhere we go, say you're my sister, so that they'll take you without a fight. So many things I could say, but let's focus on the main point, shall we? Does this story sound familiar to anybody? If you've been in here for the last several weeks, does this sound familiar? The names have changed a little bit, and the seniors changed a little bit, but we've seen this story before, haven't we? When did we see this story before? And why are we repeating the story? And why does God tell it twice? Was Moses kind of getting old when he wrote this? And you know how you kind of mix up stories when you get too old, and so he just kind of accidentally snuck it in here twice? I don't think that's probably it. What's going on here? The last time we saw this story was where? It was in chapter 12, just after God had given the promise of the seed through Sarah. And the first thing Abraham does is he runs down to Egypt because of the famine. He gets to Pharaoh's court and he says, "Sarah is my sister." Pharaoh says, "Great, I'm glad to hear that because she's super cute. I want her for myself." And so in they go, and Sarah goes to become Mrs. Pharaoh. And God comes down to Pharaoh and says, "Pharaoh, I know you didn't realize it, but you're in big trouble because you just took Abraham's wife, and I will destroy you if you don't give her back right away." And Pharaoh gets up. He says, "Oh, okay, I'll give her back right away." Pharaoh gives Abraham a whole bunch of stuff, and off he goes. A much richer man, and also with his wife. And who said we could look at this on a moral level. Don't try to give your wife, and don't try to take other people's wives. Maybe that's kind of good. But on a much deeper level, what was going on? God had just promised that through Sarah you will have the ultimate seed. What's the best way to destroy that covenant? To give away the wife. If you have no wife, you have no kids. If you have no kids, you have no offspring, you have no nation, you have no land inherit. The entire covenant goes away. So once again, God has to forcefully step in to preserve the covenant that he made. This has kind of become a habitual thing, isn't it, with humanity. People mess it up, God has to come in and save them. And so God pounds Pharaoh, or threatens to pound Pharaoh, and say, "You better give back Sarah to Abraham because," well, he didn't say because, but because this is the covenant I made with him. Now here we are in chapter 20, and what do we see all over again? The same thing. So what are we supposed to learn from this? Well, people make the same mistakes over and over. Yes, that's true. We can definitely learn that. Still shouldn't give away your wife. That's probably a good takeaway as good marital advice. What else do we see? I think it's interesting to see the placement of this story again. It's very repetitious. I definitely think we're supposed to see the parallel between the two stories. The first one takes place immediately after God gives the covenant, and Abraham immediately tries to break the covenant. But just skip ahead a little bit to the very next chapter, chapter 21. If you have headers over your chapters, what does it say? Probably something along the lines of the birth of Isaac. So just after God gives the covenant that will have a son, to just before that very son is born, we see the same thing all over again. So really, chapter 12 is very much a repeat of chapter 20. Or I said that backwards, didn't I? Chapter 20 is very much a repeat of chapter 12. So what did we learn on the first time around? God's covenant with Abraham is 100% completely, say the word if you remember it. Anybody? Unconditional. Just like God made with Abraham, they walk through the animals, but God's the only one saying, I take full responsibility for fulfilling this covenant. Abraham, there is absolutely nothing you can do to mess this up because I take all the burden upon myself, God says. Sure enough, Abraham turns right around, tries to mess it up. 25 years later, Isaac is just about to be born within the year, because when they had the whole tent conversation, God said, a year from now, you will have this kid. So within the year, Abraham has this encounter with Abimelech. He does the same thing over again. Is God still faithful, even the second time around, to keep his covenant? So what we learned the first time is totally underscored and repeated and emphasized the second time. This covenant is still absolutely unconditional. Even when Abraham tried to destroy it the second time, just before the son was born. I was thinking about this just the other night as I was prepping for all this. It is quite possible that Sarah was pregnant at this time. Do you realize this? It's possible. Within the year, and it's maybe not, maybe she was just about to become pregnant, but it's possible she was already pregnant when Abimelech took her away. And Abraham tried to, okay, see you, bye-bye. But God stepped in and he did what he had to do. And I think that's incredible. Well, there we go. Still unconditional. Which brings us to chapter 21. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised, not a shock. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of a son who was to be born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, named him Laughter. Yeah, absolutely, just like God had said. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Earlier on, we talked about that. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me, figuratively and quite literally. Made laughter for me, and everyone who hears will laugh over me. Laugh because of the funniness of the situation. Here's a 90-year-old having a kid. Laughter out of joy. You thought you were barren your whole life, and now you have a son. Isn't this wonderful? Let's all laugh for joy. All kinds of laughter going on. And sure enough, there in the little baby crib, there's Lay's little baby laughter, laughing away. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? And yet, I've borne him a son in his old age. And God fulfills his promise. So congratulations, everyone. It's a boy. Sure enough, true to his word, God gives Abraham and Sarah a baby boy when Abraham is 100 years old and Sarah is 90. I hope she had a good nanny to help with that, by the way. Because if she had to get up 5 or 6 times a night like little babies do, that poor granny is going to be worn out. So I hope she had a good nurse and help. I'm sure she did. He is the son of promise, for which Abraham waited 25 years, and which he bracketed on both ends of those 25 years by trying to give his wife away. He was circumcised according to the covenant, while Ishmael, by the way, unfortunately, well, I don't know if unfortunately, but what Ishmael was sent away. And we won't read through the whole rest of the chapter, but the rest of the chapter deals with just that, how Abraham recognizes Isaac, the younger son, is the son of promise. Well, what do you do now with Ishmael, who is, I don't even know, at least a teenager, maybe older at this point? What do you do with this son? Because now he's already had a son with Hagar. But Isaac is the son of promise who's to inherit all the stuff. So what does Abraham do with poor Hagar and poor Ishmael? He gives him a gift and he gives him the boot. And he says, you guys get out of here. You can't be around here to be my inheritance. You are not my chosen son. Get lost. I put that kind of harshly, but put yourself in Ishmael and Hagar's shoes. What do you mean? You brought me into you so that we could have a son, Abraham. Now we have a son, and now you're getting rid. You're throwing us away. You're sending us off into who knows where? What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to care for ourselves? How do you not care for us in that way? But that's what happened. And it's a pretty sad story, especially down in 15 to 22, where they end up under a bush and they're about ready to die. And the angel comes and visits and said, don't worry, I've seen you. You're also Abraham's offspring. I'll make you a nation too. Look, there's a little well over there. You go have a drink and you'll be fine. And that's what happened. But sometimes I wonder, as Genesis repeats over and over, where it says Ishmael will live in defiance or in conflict with all of his brothers. And you have to wonder if this situation didn't kind of contribute to that a little bit, why he might have been a little bit bitter towards all of his family. Well, maybe it's because they kicked him out of the home because Abraham favored the younger son and not him, who was the eldest son and should have, by culture, inherited everything. Instead, he got the boot and said, see ya, see you, but I don't want to see you. Get lost. It's an unfortunate situation. Chapter 22 continues on, however, and we have a problem. We have a situation. Because God gives a really strange command to Abraham. Chapter 22, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac. Technically, was that true? No, but he was the only son around anymore, wasn't he? Because the other son was forced out. Your only son of promise, maybe we could say, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning. He saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. We are going to go over there, and we are going to come back. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And so they both went together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself a lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Oh, but that was a hard sentence for him to say, wasn't it? So they both went off together. And when they came to the place of which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But just as he raised his hand in a very dramatic fashion and started to bring it down, that's how I pictured it in my mind, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, don't lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Again, what's going on in this weird story? God says, Abraham, I want you to go kill your kid. And Abraham says, okay. And so off they go into the wilderness. God says, don't worry, we will be back, even though God said one of them probably won't be coming back. And off they go to the mountain. And Abraham on the way up says, don't worry, God will provide the sacrifice to who he thought would probably be the sacrifice. And off they go and they build the altar. And Abraham, who is well over 100 years old right now, I don't know exactly how old, but he was 100 when he had the kid, and he was 175 when he died. So somewhere in the middle there, this happened. I'm not exactly sure how old Isaac was, probably again at least a teen, I'm guessing, maybe a little older, I'm not sure. And Abraham ties up Isaac, who apparently didn't fight too hard, and he lays up there on the altar. And Abraham takes out the knife. And he goes, Now, what was going through Abraham's mind at that point? What do you think it was? The New Testament tells us what's going through his mind, doesn't it? Genesis doesn't really say, but the New Testament does. In Abraham's mind at that point, he was saying what? I should have looked it up. I think it's Hebrews, right? He says, in his mind, God said, somehow I'm going to kill Isaac on this altar, and God is going to bring him back from the dead somehow. We've never ever seen this in human history before, but I believe God will bring Isaac back. Why would God think that Isaac would be brought back from the dead? Why would he even think that? Well, part A is because I'm supposed to kill him. But B, I know he has to come back from the dead because what? He has to be alive in order to fulfill God's promise. Now, you hear the story told, and you say, all right, what do we learn from this? Well, you should love God more than your family, right? Because Abraham, if he had to choose between God and his son, he chose God over his son. And so that's a good application, because you should love God more than your family. Is that true? Yeah. I mean, Jesus said, if you don't love me more than your brother, sister, and mother, and all those people, you're not willing to follow me. If you don't hate your family in comparison to how much you love me, you're not willing to be my follower. So that's true. That's a good application. Is that why this is here? I don't think so. Again, I think this is a demonstration of faith on Abraham's part in God's promise, so much so that Abraham said, I know we will both be coming back, because if we don't both come back, God's promise has been null and void. And I know that's not going to happen. He's already stepped in twice. He's pounded 2 major kings on my behalf before to keep the son intact. He's allowed my 90-year-old wife to conceive and have a baby in order to keep this promise intact. This little thing isn't going to stop him. And the only way I can reconcile that in my mind is that God told me to kill him, but I know he has to live afterwards, so I must be going to kill him, and God's going to somehow raise him back from the dead, because God will keep his promise. And I have absolute faith in that. So we're going to go off to that mountain. I'm going to stab my son on the chest, and somehow after I burn him as a burnt offering, those ashes are going to come back together, and we're going to walk home together. That's pretty extraordinary faith. And to that point in time, God had never yet raised anybody, as far as we know from the biblical account, from the dead. That had never been done. Now, later on, God would do that several times. But at this point, you've never seen it, ever. And that's what Abraham comes to. And it's a pretty amazing statement. And it's also a pretty good picture of later on, right, isn't it? Because Abraham marches his one and only son up to the hill to sacrifice him for upon God's promise. And we see the preservation of the seed again. We said Noah was kind of not the seed, but he was a good representative of God keeping his promise through a specific person. He kind of destroyed evil in a sense on earth because wickedness was punished. Now we have Isaac also, who is also a good picture, because there goes the son, the one and only begotten son, walking up the mountain. Some people say it was one of the mountains of Jerusalem, possibly the one we later call Calvary. I'm not for sure if that's the exact hill or not, but it's at least in the right area. And there goes the one and only son getting ready to be sacrificed by the Father for the sake of the covenant. And that's a pretty good picture of the seed who was to come someday. So, again, a picture of God preserving the nation and the seed. And we kind of have a question mark there at the end, and we're going to get to that in just a second, and I'll show you why. After this story, again, God reiterates the covenant to Abraham in the next several verses. Chapter 23, then, we get to a death. Sarah, the loving wife, who seemed to be kind of persnickety at sometimes towards his servant, and who Abraham tried to dissociate himself from at least twice, but she dies. She's 127. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And she died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, if that name sounds more familiar to you, in the land of Canaan. Abraham went to mourn and weep for her. And it goes through the whole story here of how Abraham realizes that in this foreign nation, as he is a traveler, kind of a nomad throughout this region, he owns no property in this place. And because he owns no property, he needs a place to bury Sarah. And so he goes to the locals there, the Hittites, and he said, please sell me a burial plot so I can bury my wife. And they say, well, you know what? Look, you're a man of good standing. You're a powerful guy. we will just donate to you a piece of land for you to bury your wife. Out of the graciousness and kindness of our heart, we will give this land to you. You pick any tomb you want. Any tomb you want, we will give it to you. And that's a pretty nice gesture, don't you think? But I think about that more closely. More closely. He is a foreigner in our land. He's wandering around. He moves around a lot. He's a powerful guy. Do we really want him establishing himself here and becoming competition for us, taking our resources? Do we really want him to own property here? So here's what we'll do. Let's give him a burial site. He'll bury his wife, and either he'll move on or generations will come and go, but legally that burial place is still ours. So someday we can do what? We can kind of reclaim that, and he has no legal grounds to this place. So I'm not sure they're being as generous as it initially sounds. Years ago, we had to replace our septic system at our house. And, of course, Elkhart County, where we are, the dirt type, blah, 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 we had to put in a mound system. And we don't have a whole lot of land, and so we were trying to figure out where exactly to put this place. We ended up putting it down in our pasture kind of by the road. But initially, we wanted it up a little bit closer to the other side of the house because just the plumbing would work out better, and they wouldn't have to drill through our entire yard to get to it. But we didn't have the room, and the farmer guy who owns the field next to us said, "Oh, don't worry about it. Why don't you just kind of stick your mound halfway onto my property? Because that'd work out fine, and now mine, it's no big deal, no problem." And initially, I kind of thought the same thing. Oh, that's super nice and generous of you. But I see several of you shaking your heads saying, no, don't do it. And we didn't do it because after I thought about it for a few minutes, I thought, wait a minute. First of all, they probably wouldn't give any kind of permitting for that. But second of all, we could be in serious problems sometime. Let's say somebody else buys that field from the farmer guy at some point, and he says, you know what, I don't really like your system on my field. Get off of there. Now what do I do? Or what if they try to build a house there, or what if legally, whatever happens, that's not my property anymore, and I have no claim to it. So they can do to my half or their half of my septic system whatever they want, and I can't stop them, and then I'm really messed up. I think Abraham is in the same kind of spot. They say, oh, we will just give you whatever burial place you want. And we know that probably at some point you'll move on and move around, and once you leave town, what are we going to do? Out she goes into, the back 40 somewhere, and, because this is our cave, and we don't want you settling among us. So Abraham, I think he's smart enough, he realizes what's going on. He says, no, I want to pay you full price for this. Again, they say, oh, no, it's on us. You just take whatever you want, and we'll give it to you. No, I want to pay full price. Finally, he says, fine, I will pay you full price. What do you want? He says 400 pieces of silver, and I've heard, again, two different takes on this. One, they're being very kind and generous in selling it to him. I've heard another version that says they are totally ripping it off. It's like having a flat tire in the middle of the highway in the middle of nowhere, and a tire truck comes along and says, oh, I'd be glad to sell you a new tire and set you up for only $6,000 per tire. Well, you have no choice. Abraham had no choice. He has a dead wife here. He needs to bury her. And so they say, oh, sure, fine, we'll sell it to you. We don't really want to. For only 400 measly pieces of silver, and ripped them off. I'm really not sure which it is, to be honest, because I don't know how much a cave goes for in those days. But regardless, they sell him this cave, okay? And finally he has he makes it legal. He ratifies it with all the people at the gate, all the legal procedures. This is deeded to him. This is his property now. Good move, Abraham. And we conclude the chapter with these verses here, and I'll read it to you as well, verses 17 through 20. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites before all who were in the gate of the city. They made it totally legal. Verse 19, after this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. In case you didn't get it the first two times. Verse 20, the field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as a property for a burying place by the Hittites. You got that? Where did Abraham bury his wife? It's recorded in redundancy 3 times here, and frankly, we don't care where he buried his wife. Is this true? It's halfway true. Do I care where he buried his wife? No, but Did God put this in here for a reason, or is he just throwing stuff in because he has nothing else to do with his time and he needs to fill up the parchment, and so we're going to write this 3 times? Again, the question that we always ask, why is this here? What's going on? I think this might be a good time to revisit the promise that we've been fulfilling throughout the book. So let's take a look at it. Remember what it looked like? It looked like this. Land, nation, and seed. How is God doing on his promise? Sarah is now dead. There will be no more promised seeds because she is dead. So let's evaluate how God is doing. How is he doing in terms of giving Abraham all the land that he sets his foot on in this land of Canaan that God had promised him? God had promised Abraham he would inherit this whole land, the whole thing. This will all be yours. How is he doing? How much land does Abraham officially own? Almost zero. In verses 17 through 20, it tells us exactly how much of this vast nation that Abraham owns. How much land does he own? He owns 1 field. And he had to purchase that from the Hittites at what some say was an exorbitant price. So hardly a gift from God in that sense. 1 field. How about the nation? How's he doing? What does he have?
1 son.
Thank you. I'm glad somebody answers out loud. That really helps me. He has 1 boy. Not exactly a flourishing nation at this point. Now, it's been over 25 years, probably closer to 30 or more, since God initially gave the promise in chapter 12. Abraham's well over 100 years old now, and Sarah is gone, so he's not having any more children of promise at this point. He has 1 boy. Finally, the ultimate seed, the last part of the promise. How's God doing? We really haven't heard much about that, have we? We really haven't made much progress on that front. So God's grand promise to Abraham is down to 1 field and 1 boy. Is this correct? Is that right? And the 1 piece of land he owns here, he goes into great excruciating detail. The field of Ephron in Machpelah, which is to the east of Mamre, the field and the cave that was in it and all the trees that were in the field throughout the whole area were made to Abraham as his possession. That's it. What do we see here? What do we see about God's promises anyway? Sometimes they might take a while. Do we trust enough, even when it doesn't look so good, even when it doesn't look promising, do we still have confidence that he'll keep his word? That's a toughie. What about someday I will return and call my people up to the clouds of the air and will be off, and righteousness and justice will reign forever? We're going on 2,000 years, people. It's taking a long time, a lot longer than some believers have thought it would. Do we still believe it? It doesn't look good right now, does it? It's kind of a running joke among some circles. Oh, he's coming back, huh? Oh, okay, ha, ha, ha. And some goofball little cult will say, oh, I know exactly when he's coming back, and then he doesn't. Then it's another joke all over again. Do we still have confidence? Yeah, maybe we should, because we know how this promise turned out, because we have the vantage point of looking back and seeing it. It just took a while. How about the current promises that we have today that we haven't seen fulfilled yet? Can we still have confidence? Even though it takes a while, and even though the newspapers say it doesn't look good. Or even when the newspapers say everybody's getting ready to attack Israel and they will be obliterated. I think he'll keep his promise. But it takes a while sometimes. But there's one more twist to this I want to get through quick before we conclude this morning. I want to reread this in a different version. This is ESV that we just read it out of this first time, but I want to read it out of NASB quickly because there's one little detail in there that NASB includes that ESV kind of, I like the way it's written a little bit better. It says, so Ephron's field, which is in Machpelah, which faced Mamre, the field which was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, and all the confines of its border, were deeded over to Abraham for possession in the presence of, ESV says, the Hittites. Those are the people that lived there at this time. But NASB says this, in the presence of the sons of Heth, which were the Hittites. I mean, it's the same thing, but NASB goes a little bit more literal and calls it the sons of Heth. Before all who were in the gate of the city. After this, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave at the field of Machpelah, facing Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field of the cave that's in it were deeded over to Abraham for a burial site by the sons of Heth. What does that matter? Who cares whose sons they were? Who is Heth anyway? We don't even care. I think we do care. Who are the sons of Heth? If you will remember way back a few weeks ago, Heth was actually one of Canaan's sons. Chapter 10, verse 5 says, "And Canaan begat Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth." So Heth, the Hittites, are descended from that line, while Abraham was descended from the lines of Seth. Seth and Heth, don't get confused, okay? So what? Well, God also made a promise in chapter 10, verse 25. A couple verses later, he says, "And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he will be to his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God enlarged Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant." So if Heth was a descendant of Canaan, and the Hittites, the sons of Heth, were descendants of that line, and God promised that the descendants of Seth, that'd be Abraham's line, I'm saying that backwards, the descendants of Canaan would be servants to the descendants of Shem. The Canaanites would be servants to what would become the Israelites. Now that's significant. We can see the tension between the two lines forming all over again. Once again, I ask, how is God doing here? Who is subservient to who at this point? Not only does Abraham only have one field and one boy, but he has to barter and beg from it from who, of all people? The descendants of Canaan. Everything's backwards. Abraham isn't over the descendants of Canaan. It's the other way around. So it's uncomfortable as far as that goes. So it looks, by all appearances, like God is failing in his promise in a sense. He's no more than a regular guy who just lost his wife and he has to beg for a piece of land. But he does have God's promises to go back to. So in chapter 24, well, let's get to that next week. We don't have time for it this week. But I'll leave you right there on this very, very sad note. So far, it looks like God's promise to Abraham is not doing so well. And in fact, in Hebrews chapter 11, I know we're over time, sorry, but we got to conclude with this. We know that this is actually kind of the way that he felt too. We see in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 16, I just want to read this to you really quick. "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go to a place that he was to receive in his inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents," blah, blah, blah. Skip to verse 13 for time. "All these, Abraham, Sarah, whatnot, died in faith, having not received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar off, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth," so much so that he had to beg for a piece of land. "For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking the land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." And Abraham lived, and he died, and he never got to see the realization of God's promise to him. Do you realize that? And again, a lot of Christians here in this life, even today, they will be raised on promises of heaven someday, and God will rule and reign, and justice will be done ultimately, and they live and they die, and physically in this life, they never get to see the fulfillment of that promise. And that includes us so far here in this auditorium. Do we still have confidence in the promise? That's what chapter 11 was written for, to encourage us to say, look, the people back then, they never saw the promise fulfilled in their lifetime. We people today, so far, it could happen today, we don't know, but so far we've never seen this promise fulfilled in our life. Do we still believe it? Abraham did, and it was counted to him for righteousness, Romans chapter 4. All right, we got to quit. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you this morning for these fantastic stories of Abraham. Of course, we know the stories aren't about Abraham at all, but they're about how you preserved your line, you keep your word, you fulfill your promises, you're good to your people, you provide redemption for the mess-ups that we do since Eden and ever since. Help us to understand who you are through these stories. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Thank you. You're dismissed.